Nightclubs, music, dancing and new fashions are some of our overriding images of the roaring 1920s, a decade characterised by excess, freedom and jazz. Dancing was one of the most popular social activities during the 20s. In towns and villages across the country, dances were put on in local dance halls with varying admission fees, so they were accessible to all but the poorest in society. For those with a greater disposable income, there were nightclubs. Perhaps surprisingly for a government archive, the National Archives holds a significant number of records about nightclubs in the 1920s, as they were regularly raided by the Metropolitan Police for breaking licensing laws. One club that features heavily in our records is the 43 Club, which loomed large in the nighttime economy of London. It was owned by the notorious Kate Meyrick, nicknamed the nightclub queen. Meyrick was born in Dublin in 1875 to a middle-class family. In 1899, at the age of 19, she married a doctor and moved to England, where she assisted her husband on psychiatric wards for around 15 years, during which time she bore 8 children, 6 daughters and 2 sons. The marriage, however, was not a happy one. Records held at the National Archives show that Kate Meyrick first filed for divorce in 1910, but it was not granted. Meyrick separated from her husband at the end of the First World War and began seeking out opportunities to make a living and pay for her children's education. In 1919, she came across an advert looking for a partner to run tea dances. After gaining another business partner, they opened Dalton's Club in Leicester Square, and just 2 months later, a second club on Bedford Street. Dalton's would be short-lived, closing in 1920 after Meyrick and the co-owners were accused of allowing prostitutes to frequent the club. Despite this early setback, her reign as the nightclub queen was only just beginning. Over the course of her career, Meyrick ran a significant number of nightclubs in London, and even one in Paris for a short period. Her clubs were in locations across the West End of London and included the Manhattan, the Silver Slipper and the Little Club, but her longest-running business was the 43 Club, open from 1921 until 1933 at number 43 Gerrard Street in Soho. Meyricks spent the grand sum of £2,000 on furniture and blue and gold decorations for the club's opening, turning the dank cellars into a palace of gaiety. Whilst the club changed name numerous times, her regulars always affectionately referred to it as the 43. Meyrick was very active in the running of her clubs and could often be found at the entrance greeting members and taking an entrance fee from visitors. Much of her work in the earlier years concentrated on running the club's restaurants, and we see her listed as a confectioner in the 1921 census. Film stars, musicians, sportsmen, showgirls, writers, artists, thespians, military men, aristocracy, murderers, drug dealers, royalty and refugees all passed through Meyrick's doors. Kate said, quote, "How many people can claim to have had intimate acquaintance with royalty, with gangsters, with the darlings of the stage, with notorious murderers? All those types I have known as the general public can never hope to know them, with the trappings of fame or notoriety stripped from the essential humanity beneath." End quote. Kate frequently broke licensing laws by selling alcohol without a license or outside of permitted hours, and she was often accused of allowing disreputable people into her clubs. As a result, her premises were often raided by the Metropolitan Police. During the war, social concerns about the impact of alcohol on society had intensified. Regulation of alcohol was enacted in 1916 as part of the Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA, as it's better known. The Licensing Act of 1921 extended these wartime restrictions around selling alcohol within permitted hours, specifying it couldn't be sold on premises after 11 p.m. This press cutting tells us about the Home Secretary, William Johnson Hicks's crusade against nightclubs. Johnson Hicks intensely disapproved of nightclubs, and his campaign against them focused on the moral policing of social spaces, which was deemed controversial. Police could not legally enter a club unless they had a warrant. In order to get the warrant, police had to go undercover in plain clothes and ultimately break the law themselves by attempting to buy intoxicants after hours. Johnson Hicks spoke of the difficulties, stating that, quote, "The police are fighting the nightclub evil with one arm tied behind their back. They are helpless at present. They cannot get evidence except by acting the despicable part of a spy. But we are now preparing legislation which will purge London of this horrible blot on the city's life," end quote. The records from these various raids and undercover police observations provide detailed snapshots of evenings spent at Meyricks clubs, including the names and addresses of staff and customers, and even a list of the food and drink being consumed. By 1928, Meyrick had paid fines of more than £1,300, served a prison sentence of 6 months, and had been before the courts 7 times. However, this was not enough of a deterrent for Meyrick, who simply reopened the clubs under new names and continued resolutely in her pursuits. The threat of raids and the closure of her clubs were, however, a constant concern. Peculiarly, between December 1927 and early 1928, Meyricks clubs seemed to be acting within the law on the 14 occasions they were raided, and the police could not obtain enough evidence to close them, despite tip-offs that the law was being broken. So why was this? From 1914 to 1928, George Goddard, a plainclothes police officer, was instructed to report on whether premises were observing the licensing laws. During 1928, although his reports about Kate's clubs included some eye-raising details, there were not enough in them to justify police action to shut down the premises. However, suspicions were raised when, despite his modest salary, Goddard began driving expensive cars and living in a plush townhouse. In May 1928, a raid was conducted on one of Meyricks' clubs without Goddard's knowledge, and it was discovered that the law was being broken, leading to the uncovering of a conspiracy between Meyrick and Goddard. Following this, enough evidence was gathered to convict Meyrick of selling intoxicants without a licence and after hours. She was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. A case was also being built relating to charges of bribery and corruption against Goddard and Meyrick, with Goddard being dismissed from the force in October 1928 and jailed the following year. The charge of bribing a police officer saw Meyrick receive her longest prison sentence of 15 months hard labour in Holloway Prison, though she tried to appeal her sentencing. We can see from her petition in our Home Office records that her defence rested on the claim that Goddard was blackmailing her. Unfortunately for Meyrick, her appeal did not help reduce her sentence. We know from her memoir that she found the experience of jail insufferable. Her daughter sent a letter to the Home Secretary in 1929. She writes that Meyrick's family were, quote, "terribly worried about the state of their mother's health," end quote. Meyrick was now in her mid-50s, and her children raised concerns that, quote, "she gets thinner and frailer every time we see her," end quote. They argued that she was not fit to undergo imprisonment, fearing that she would die in jail. Meyrick ended up serving a year in jail as opposed to 15 months, and upon her release was greeted outside Holloway by a large group of revellers dressed in evening dress. This newspaper article relays that she celebrated her release with a champagne party at her home overlooking Regent's Park. Meyrick would go on to be sentenced to jail yet again in 1930. Throughout the 20s, Meyrick made the most of her notoriety and brushes with the law, selling her story to newspapers and telling the world about her colourful and intimate dealings with the world of nightclubs and her battles against the killjoys. These stories later formed the basis of her memoir. Meyrick truly embraced the world of nightclubs. Whilst she made and lost fortunes during her endeavours, she can certainly be seen to have succeeded in her aim of providing for her family. All 8 of her children received a private education, and 2 of her daughters even married into the peerage, one marrying a baron and the other an earl. When she passed away in 1933 at the age of 56 from complications with the flu, the press reported on the outpouring of grief by many in the metropolis who saw Meyrick as the personification of nightclub life.